This week, we're going through 5 tips for managing and understanding conflicts of interest so we don't end up with double the consequences. Hello and welcome. I'm Catherine Corin, your procurement guide. With over 30 years in procurement, both in the private and public sectors in Canada, I have lots of tips, tricks, and stories to tell to help you along your procurement journey. This week, we're talking about conflicts of interest and understanding it and some of the consequences if you don't manage it well. So, first of all, the first tip is to understand what constitutes a conflict of interest. There's lots of policies and lists. Majority of people limit their thinking to financial interest or family member on a company that may be responding to an RFP, but it's also using your resources, your insider information to pursue your personal interests, or even using your position to pursue personal interests or that of family and friend members. So, I have a story I have another story later in the video that is specific to a procurement evaluation process, but right now I have a story in the real world that might help bring this home. So it's about minor hockey. Surprise, surprise. There's lots of stuff there. But in this particular case, it's about using someone's position for their own personal interests. So, minor hockey associations may have a coach mentor or a person that is part of the association that's paid to help advise coaches of the various teams because a lot of the coaches are volunteers. In 2020, when we were all under restrictions and couldn't go to public places, they did open up under 18 sports so that, kids still had a place to go release their energy. But when it came to minor hockey practices, it was closed doors. Parents, nobody could go in. All it could be was the coaches and the players. Well, this particular coach mentor chose to use his position to be able to attend the practices of his son. He used his role to gain access to a practice that all other parents were closed out of, but using it for his own personal interests. One could say, yeah, he was in there advising the coaches, but he wasn't. The coaches had a problem with it themselves, but, couldn't really speak up about it because they were volunteers. So that's just one example of someone using their position to their own personal advantage in the real world. So it's not just about financially invested in a company that wins a contract award or your family member wins a contract award. Those seems to be the most common ones everybody thinks of, but it's not. There's a broader range of things. It's pursuing personal interests, those are your family members, former. So the second tip to help, like the first one is to understand what the conflicts are. The second one is to have policies and procedures for disclosure, even if they're not real, just being able to clarify if they are actually a conflict of interest or not. Get advice. Have procedures to identify, disclose, and manage it, whether real, perceived, um, like the policies and procedures should explain what constitutes a conflict. How do you report it or get advice on it? And then what are the steps to mitigate it? The consequences, which I alluded to in the intro, is that, 5 tips versus double the consequences. There are like 10 or more consequences to not disclosing a conflict of interest. Obvious one is compromising the integrity of the procurement process. Then you lose public trust and confidence in how you award contracts. And I think in Canada, we have a lot of those in the news that, there are, you know, whether real or not, conflicts of interest, and everybody's getting upset about contract awards to friends of friends of friends. There's legal and commercial risks, obviously, where you can be sued for not following your RFP process if it's awarded to someone who's not necessarily the highest scoring. Reputational damage, obviously, kind of ties to the trust issue. Financial losses, because you could be paying a heck of a lot more than had you followed your procurement process in the first place, or, paying out lawsuits, costs of unsuccessful vendors, cost of preparing their proposals in a process that was unfair. Disruption of the procurement process. Now, this really would mostly occur with federal procurement, because if someone were to contest a decision or raise a red flag, the CITT will investigate, and the process is stopped during that investigation. Provinces may be affected under this Canadian Free Trade Agreement, because there is some language in there about delays while things are being investigated under the trade agreement rules. But I have not personally seen this invoked, and I don't know how it would be. I'll do some further research maybe, and see if ever that term has been invoked, and I'll go research that term a little bit more. Um, if the vendor marketplace don't trust your process, or don't trust you, or think, they're only going to give it to their friends, you're going to have reduced competition. And less people are going to be bothered to respond to you. Or they will respond and they're going to pad the rates because you're going to be deemed a difficult client. Or they know that, okay, well, if they're going to just give it to that one, I'm going to raise my rates. The organization you work for is going to kind of erode. You know, if they can't trust the ethics in an organization, your culture erodes. People are going to be dissuaded from pursuing any opportunities within your organization. They're not going to trust anything within the organization, because if you break the rules on this one, who's to say you're not breaking the rules everywhere else? And then finally, regulatory consequences. If it's found out there's been some nepotism, conflict of interest awards, then there's going to be some regulations imposed upon the organization to help prevent those issues in future. So let's move into the third tip about mandatory disclosure. If you have the policies and procedures for people to understand, well, then there could be a policy about mandatory disclosure. Not that we're policing people, but just, for instance, in an evaluation committee, having a conflict of interest declaration form signed off by evaluators prior to them having access to proposals to evaluate. It's a very simple way of identifying potential conflicts of interest in advance, because you would name the companies, and if it's for individuals, the name of the individuals, and then people will go, oh yeah, I used to work for them, or I own a piece of their company, etc., like all those types of things. And so my other example was for a process that I was fairness advisor for, and we went through 6 proposals, and on the final proposal, one of the evaluators stood up and said, I have to recuse myself. My son is the lead on this proposal. I can't evaluate this. And then he left the room. I looked at the chair of the committee and asked for a recess so that we could have a discussion, because my concern was this person wasn't going to evaluate his son's proposal, but he just scored all the other proposals. Or he was in a consensus discussion that we can't undo that discussion. Like anything he may have contributed or said to the other evaluators, the damage is already done. So, had they done a conflict of interest disclosure up front, he would not have been an evaluator whatsoever because he would have identified his son was one of the bidders. So then he should not have been evaluating any of the proposals at all. Now, in this particular instance, we mitigated the issue because they were awarding contracts to everyone that responded in this particular case. It's very rare that happens, so they lucked out. But had they not, we would have had to revisit the scoring, remove his scores, possibly reconvene a brand new evaluation committee, and that would have delayed the process further. But luckily, in this particular case, everybody was getting a contract. So it was just more of verifying the information through the process that everybody deserved or met the requirements to be awarded a contract. So luckily that one worked out, but it could have been a bit of a disaster to fix after the fact. So the fourth tip is how to have proper management strategies. So ties to the previous comment is that, you have appropriate steps to manage it. Like you have the declaration form. In some cases, people will ask before they sign the form, this is somebody I worked for 3 years ago, and then you determine the mitigation strategies. So in some cases, you have a committee of 5 people and you take a look on a case by case basis. Is this a real conflict of interest? Might it be a perceived conflict of interest, or is there nothing at all that, you know, we can actually say someone who used to work for a company 5 years ago, it's not necessarily going to influence the process negatively as a conflict of interest. And especially if you have a committee of 3 to 5, they're only one voice out of the others. If their scores were definitely an outlier, then that would trigger, okay, there's obviously something off here, and then we could remove their scores. But again, it's managing on a case by case basis and just determining, okay, do we need to remove the person? Is it fine to have them in the process and it'll balance out with the other evaluators on the committee? Uh, just determine on a case by case basis. And finally, culture of integrity. Let's make it okay for people to come forward and not fearful of repercussions or any sort of accusation of wrongdoing. Provide regular training on an ongoing basis so people understand the ethical boundaries and what could potentially be an issue. Let them speak up to inquire. It doesn't have to be a real conflict of interest. And that's where I say that, we're not accusing them of wrongdoing. We're trying to determine how the marketplace or the public may interpret the information. So it could be completely innocent and no issue whatsoever, but let's just double check, would an outsider see it differently? And I've had situations where someone asked, my former boss is responding. And they had a good relationship, but it was years ago. But which way could it go? Could the competing vendors see that there is a bias for their former boss's proposal? Or could their former boss not think they had that great of a relationship? And that former boss, if unsuccessful, thinks there was a bias against them. Again, you have more than one person on the evaluation committee. It depends on what kind of a role of influence this particular individual has, and deal with it on a case by case basis. Hope this is helpful. On a related note, check out the video on vendor communication during an RFP process.